Oh man, I used to love that jam back in the 80s. Welcome to Flindog Woodwork. So I know today everybody's got a cell phone. Most people have their heads buried in their cell phone 90% of the time. However, we're not going to be talking about that type of caul today. We're going to be talking about the woodworking caul. So we're going to take a look at 3 different types of woodworking cauls that I think might be a valuable addition to your workshop. Hold on a second, I got to take this call. Speak, my brother. So before we get into talking about these 3 different cauling methods, let's first talk about what a caul is to help out the beginning woodworker. Let's go take a look at what it's used for. So over here I have this beautiful tabletop glued up. Now as you can see, it's very uneven. There's areas of the wood that's raised higher than other areas, and that's what a caul is used for. It's used to flatten that table surface out and make sure it's perfectly flat. But that's not the only thing that a caul can be used for. Sometimes when you're gluing up a panel, you'll have a huge bow in it. Let's go take a look at another example. So when bowing typically occurs, it occurs when you're doing wider glue ups. Here you can see an extremely exaggerated example of what a bow might look like. Both of these issues can be extremely frustrating, especially for the beginning woodworker who may not know how to fix these problems. So let's take a look at our first cauling method to help us fix these issues. So the first thing that we need to consider is how wide do we want our cauls to be. Now typically people want their cauls to be 24 to 36 inches wide. If you go beyond that, this type of caul typically is pretty ineffective. So the reason that I typically don't go above 36 inches when creating this type of caul is this caul can become ineffective if it's too long. If you're only applying clamping pressures to the very end of this caul, it can bow upward and downward, therefore making your caul ineffective. However, if you're only using this caul on the very end of your workpiece and you could apply clamps to the center of the caul, you can make this caul as long as you want. So making this caul really couldn't be any more simple. All you need to do is to head over to your local big box store and pick up some hardwood. Now I would recommend something like oak or maple and stay away from something like poplar. Once you have your hardwood, the only other thing that you're going to need is some packing tape. So let's get started on building this caul. Now when purchasing your hardwood, I would recommend that you go with a hardwood that's at least 4 inches wide. Now I've never seen hardwoods for sale at the big box stores that are under 4 inches, but make sure that that hardwood is 4 inches wide. So for my example today, I'm going to be using a piece of scrap mahogany that I had laying around my shop. Now this is about 4 1/4 inches wide and it's 3/4 inch thick. So I know that the big box stores claim that their hardwoods are planed and jointed, however I just don't trust that. So when we get our hardwood from one of these big box stores, we want to make sure that we have a completely flat and even edge, because this is going to be used to make our tabletops. So let's run a piece of hardwood through the table saw and make sure that we have a completely flat edge. Once we have that freshly cut edge, we're going to take that edge and flip it over so it's facing the fence of the table saw. Once that's done, we can then make a 2-inch cut. So let's go ahead and do that right now. So we'll move our table saw and set it to right at 2 inches. Once that's done, we can run it through the table saw. So now that we have our first caul made, let's take a look at the dimensions of this caul. Now as you can see from this image here, it's quite a bit taller than it is wide. And that's because this caul is going to be acting like an I-beam. This caul is going to have a lot of pressure put on it, so we want it to be able to support all that clamping pressure. Now that we have our first caul made, let's take our other piece and run that through the table saw as well. That way we have 2 cauls that are the same height. So now that we have these 2 caul mades, the only thing left to do is to place some packing tape on each one of these cauls. The packing tape makes sure that that wood glue won't adhere to these cauls. So let's do that right now. So in my shop, I don't really have any packing tape, so I'm going to use this generic Tivik tape and apply it to both sides of the caul. That way we can make sure that that glue doesn't stick. Now that I have tape applied to one side, I'll flip both of the cauls over and repeat the process. So here's how the caul system will work. You'll have one caul on top and one caul on bottom. You'll also have the side of the panel clamped together to apply that horizontal pressure. Once you have the cauls in place, you can watch this exaggerated tabletop get completely flattened out when I tighten the cauls. And here you can see that is much straighter, and if you're working with perfectly jointed pieces of wood, this is going to be completely flat. So as you can see, this is a super simple design. You could batch out a ton of these in just a few minutes. It's also very effective at what it does, and that's flattening out panels. Now there is one little accessory that I might suggest you get if you're going to be using cauls like this. Let me show you. So if you saw one of my recent videos, you know that I just discovered this Bessie edge clamp. This clamp can be used in combination with your cauls and your horizontal clamps to even further flatten out those panels, especially in the center of the panels. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So here's what I'm talking about. A lot of times when you're gluing up your panels, you may have some misaligned boards in the center of your panel, and that's where these Bessie edge clamps really come into play. Now by applying these edge clamps to your caul and attaching them to your horizontal clamp, you can apply some vertical pressure to your workpiece and flatten out those panels. You can also apply multiple of these edge clamps just to make sure that the entire board is flat. So that wraps up our first panel straightening solution. Before we move on to our second item, I ask you to do me a favor. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, leave a like, leave a comment, as it really does help out this small growing channel. Now let's move on to our second panel straightening option. Also, for any of the tools that I'm using in today's video, I'll leave links in the description below so you can go check out any of these tools if you find them interesting. Now let's move on to our second panel straightening solution. So this is a 4-way clamp that I purchased about a year ago. Now I purchased this because the price was right and I had a wide tabletop that I needed to flatten out. However, I think I made this clamp just a little too wide. Now the nice thing about this clamp is you can make it as wide as you want or as small as you want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this down and I'm going to make it into a usable size. So I just measured that clamp and I had it at 43 inches wide, and that's just way too long. No wonder it was bowing at the top and bottom when I would tighten it down. Now I've cut it down to 28 inches long, so let's see if that fixes the problem. So let's take a look at how this clamp works. Now the nice thing about this clamp is it comes with 2 assembly kits. This allows you to make 2 clamps that you can place over your panel on 2 different areas. Now if we look at this diagram right here, you can see that it applies a pressure from all 4 sides. It provides pressure up and down as well as left and right. This makes sure that your panel is completely flat and prevents any bowing in your panel. So let's take a closer look at some of the components of this clamp. So in order to assemble these clamps, the manufacturer recommends that you get a 2x4. Then you slice it in half. So once your 2x4 is sliced in half, you attach these locking mechanisms to either side of the 2x4. Now I will have to say that these locking mechanisms are made of plastic, so that's something to be aware of. Now that we have all the locking mechanisms attached to the 2x4s, it's time to take a look at the jaws of the clamps. So each clamp comes with 2 separate jaws. The first jaw is simply just a jaw to hold your panel in place as you're tightening it down. The second jaw holds your panel in place, but also allows you to clamp it down and straighten out your workpiece. So here's how this clamp works. As you can see from this mock-up, each side has got a bunch of notches on it that easily allow you to adjust the clamps for any size panel that you're gluing up. If we take a look at the end of the clamp, you can see how it provides that horizontal pressure through this pad as you tighten it down. Now I know this is vertical in this image here, but typically this would be on its side. As you increase the tension from the sides, it automatically pulls the bottom and the top inward, creating that perfectly flat panel. So the nice thing about this clamp is it's inexpensive and you can make it with just a couple of 2x4s. Now I know Rockler makes a little bit higher quality clamp and I think it's around 130 bucks. Now if you really want to spend a lot of money, I know that Woodpeckers makes a Clampzilla and I think it goes for about 750 bucks, believe it or not. So these 4-way clamps are a great way to provide pressure and support to your entire panel when you're doing your glue ups. Now that we've taken a look at the 4-way clamp, let's move on to our last and final item. So this next panel straightening solution is one that I'm super excited to show you. Now I've never made one of these, so I'm going to take you along the process as I build one. So this next solution is another type of caul. However, this is a caul that's got a bow in it. It's a little bit thicker in the center than it is on the ends. Now I've seen a lot of woodworkers use these and I've always wanted to make one on my own. So let's start that process right now. So this type of caul is called a cambered caul, and this is a caul that's been used for years in woodworking. It's quite simple to make, and I'm going to show you 2 ways to make it. To make this caul, you're going to need some hardwood. And once again, I looked in my scrap pile and I found this piece of cherry. Now this is about 5 inches wide and it's about a 3/4 inch thick piece of wood. So let's take this and let's do the same thing that we did with the previous caul and mill it down to about 2 inches wide, and then we'll go from there. So first off, I'm going to clean up one side of this piece of wood. I'm going to run it through the table saw, and then we're going to move on to the next step. Just like before, we're going to take that freshly cut edge and we're going to place it against the fence. Then we're going to cut two 2-inch strips to create the cauls that we want. Now that we have our two 2-inch cauls cut out, it's now time to cut these down to 28 inches long, which is the size that I've been making all of these cauls. Now I've set my stop block to 28 inches exactly, so now all I have to do is to make the two cuts. Since we know that both of these pieces of wood are 28 inches long, I'm going to strike a line right at 14 inches on both pieces of wood. Next, I'm going to carry that line across both cauls. So the reason that we struck a line at the center of these cauls is because this is going to be the thickest portion of this caul. Since these are 28 inches long, I'm going to remove about 1/8 of an inch at the end of each one of these cauls and taper it all the way to the center. So the first caul we're going to be making will be made at the jointer. The first thing I need to do is to set the depth of cut to 1/8 of an inch, and I've already gone ahead and done that. So now let's move on to the next step. So I've taken a Sharpie and I've made the center line just a little bit more visible. Now we want to align that center line with the very edge of the outfeet table. Once that alignment has been made, I'm going to take a stop block and attach it to the fence. Once this has been done, I'm simply going to drop the caul into the jointer so that the line lines up with the outfeed table and push it all the way through the jointer. Now that we've done one side, I'm simply going to flip the piece around and do the same thing on the other side. So let's take a closer look at our final product. You can see on one side it's completely flat, but if we flip it over, you can see that it's got a nice wobble to it. So if you're a beginning woodworker or you don't have a jointer, I'm going to show you a different method on how to make this cambered caul in just a moment. Also, if you're a beginning woodworker, make sure you feel comfortable doing that at the jointer before you attempt to make a caul at the jointer. So the second way to set up some cambered caul is just a little bit easier in my opinion. All you need is some setup blocks, some double-sided tape, and a table saw. Let me show you how to do it. So this next procedure, I'm going to take an 1/8 inch setup block and I'm going to apply a little bit of double-sided tape to one side. I'm going to remove the sticky portion of it, and then I'm going to attach it to my rough cut caul. Just like so. So once I have my setup block attached to my rough cut caul, I'm then going to take the center line and align it with the center of the table saw. Then I'm going to move my fence until it just touches. Once that happens, I'm just going to lock the fence down. So one thing to note here is that the front of the caul, you should be able to easily slide it back and forth against your table saw blade. But once you move it towards the back, it should begin to give a little bit of resistance. Once you have all that in place, it's simply a matter of turning on your table saw and making the cut. Once you have that cut made, you'll simply remove your setup block, you'll flip your board over, and you'll attach it to the opposite and diagonal side. Then it's just a matter of running it through the table saw once again. Now we can make the cut on the opposite side. Now we can see it's completely flat on one side, but if we turn it around, you can see that that wobble is there once again, which is what we're looking for. So now that we have two cambered cauls cut out two different ways, let's apply it to a panel surface and see how it works. But before we clamp it up, I want to do a couple of things. I want to put some arrows on the cambered caul just so that I know which way the actual panel should go. Lastly, I want to apply some tape to the ends just so that we don't have any sticking from glue squeeze out. So let's take a closer look at how this works. Since the fattest portion of each caul is in the center, most of the pressure initially is right in the center of your panel. Once you tighten down either side, it will begin to put pressure on either side. So if I place my panels right in the middle and I clamp my clamps down, you'll see that the sides start to come together and it provides even pressure across that panel. Now there should be even pressure from the left to the right and even the center. So let's review the 3 ways we just looked at that showed us how we can straighten out our panels. Now we started off with a standard caul, and these are by far the easiest to make and are great tools for the beginning woodworker. Next we took a look at the 4-way clamp, and this is a great tool. I'm going to leave a link for a cheap option for this tool. Last week we took a look at the cambered caul, and this is a great tool that I've always wanted to build, and now I'm glad I finally have a set of them. Well, I really hope you enjoyed checking out these 3 methods you can use to flatten out your panels when doing glue-ups. I'm super excited to have my first set of camber cauls, and I hope you use these in your workshop as well. If you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button, leave a like, as it really does help out this small growing channel. Until next time, take care as always.